Welcome to our panel this morning, In Partnership with Nature, how Inuit and other Indigenous teachings, knowledge, and societal values are informing hopeful new approaches to the climate crisis. I wanted to first introduce myself. My name is Jessica Clogg. I'm the founder of the ReLaw Initiative at West Coast Environmental Law, and I'm joining you from beautiful but rainy Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish territory on the west coast of Canada. We have an amazing panel this morning. Joining us is Rihanna Seymour-Houry. She is the ReLaw manager at West Coast Environmental Law, and her work has focused on Anishinaabe and Halkwominam water laws and how the laws and the teachings from the water can inform humans of their responsibilities to each other, the natural world, and the spirit world. Can I just say hi, Rihanna? Also joining us is Shelley Avaram from Iqaluit. And Shelley is a Ashoka Fellow who is bridging the gap in Arctic governance, where Indigenous knowledge and Western science are largely disconnected. She's working to surface the gifts, the unique gifts of Inuit youth to work alongside Western societies. Hello, Shelley. Also joining us is Ashoka Fellow Joe Heath. And Joe is going to share insights from decades of experience working with Inuit communities to capture real-time data about Arctic sea ice changes to benefit communities and conservation. Joel will share lessons learned from his empowering new model, which ensures data is held and protected by the community. And I'm also very pleased to introduce Barb Steele from Ashoka Canada, our Executive Director, who will be our session coordinator. I'll turn it over to Barb for a moment.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this important panel. And to get ourselves connected and warmed up, I thought we could greet each other. In Canada, we tend to do that by acknowledging the land that we're on. So I'm Barb Steele, and I'm dialing in from Toronto, Canada, which sits on the traditional territories in the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. So why don't you, wherever you're from, just say hello to each other, and you can do that via the chat. And then we'll see some of the locations around the world that are represented here today. And we'll just give that a moment to come in. Okay. And who are we seeing here? Just one moment. Okay. I'm not able to see the chat, Jessica, so why don't you take it away. Thank you all. Keep logging in and say hello to each other. Jessica, over to you.
Wonderful. So why don't we just start by asking each of our panelists to just take a moment to tell us a bit about your home and how climate change is impacting it. Joel, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm in Iqaluit, Nunavut right now. Our charity is based in Sanikiluaq. And been working with hunters out on the ice there for 20 years now. And so a lot has changed. My perspective has also changed a lot. I got started in Sanikiluaq doing grad school work, and people congratulated me on getting my PhD, but they were like, we also have to let you know you're still kindergarten in Inuit knowledge. And so it was a real defining moment for me where I basically gave up academics to work and study under Inuit and learn their perspectives and try and bring together these different ways of knowing. And so I've been learning a lot about their perspectives on change. And unfortunately, Candace, who works for us and Iqaluit, wasn't able to make it today because of the current outbreak in Nunavut. And so she would share some of those perspectives. But from our perspective in Sanikiluaq anyways, there's been a lot of changes in the ice in terms of the distribution of animals, the timing of migration, new species showing up. So it's affecting food security. People get more than 50% of their food comes from harvesting out on the land. And so it's not just going hunting, it's your food security, it's the way of life, it's the culture and the language. And so we're really taking a holistic approach to trying to connect together all those things: Indigenous environmental terminology, food security. Even last winter, it got cold early, so it's not always warming like everyone thinks. It got cold earlier and the ice formed, but then it snowed on top of the ice, and that insulated the ice, that kept it from freezing more, and the currents washed it away from the bottom. And so last winter, areas that were normally safe were actually the ones that were more dangerous. So these are the sorts of things we're dealing with that affect safety going out hunting and bringing back that food, as well as the changing to the animals. So
Thanks, Joel.
we'll get into some more details later.
Yeah. Shelley, tell us a little bit about the reality of climate change as you're experiencing it in the place where you live and work, which I understand is close to Joel.
Well, close-ish. I think when you look at a map of Canada, I'm way up on the north end of Baffin Island in Nunavut territory, and even when they show weather maps in Canada, I'm usually cut off. Like, we're just this other extra part of the country. So my name is Shelley Elverum. I work with an amazing program called Ikavik, which in Inuktitut means a bridge. Uvanga kawisakti Inuit kayamaya tukhangit, uvanga annakuta, kovia sukpunga takoyana kakit. So in the Inuit language, I said that I study Inuit knowledge, which sounds very academic. My Inuktitut name is Tall Woman, which sounds like I'm like some huge giant. I'm like 5'7", but I'm pretty big up here. And I'm really happy to speak with you because I think when people think on the surface about climate change, you know, one of the first places that they think about is the Arctic. Everyone knows that it's the canary in the coal mine, but what that actually means when you live here is probably a little bit different than what you might think. So Joel mentioned about, you know, ice and how important it is for people to survive. I think one of the things though, when we're framing this discussion that we're going to have, is that for Inuit, and full disclosure, I am not Inuk, I am glow in the dark white. I grew up thinking I was Inuit and had sort of a rude awakening when I was 7 that I actually was not Indigenous, and I had to struggle with that. I've been back up north now for 20 years. Something must have been in the air, Joel, because you and I think came up around the same time. But I think that as we're having this conversation today, it'd be really good to keep in mind that the people of the north are so used to uncertainty. You know, we're dealing with the uncertainty of COVID and the whole world has gone crazy. For Inuit, that uncertainty and that ability to adapt and to create is remarkable. So I think that if we're looking at the fastest changing place on Earth being the Arctic, I also look and have a lot of great things to say about the youth and their role in dealing with a changing climate. So in Nunavut, 60% of our population is under the age of 30, which is why I think it's such a critical discussion to have when we're talking about climate change, to not just talk about the fact that the ice is going and that it's thinner and that, you know, from an ecosystem perspective, things are changing. We also have to look at what this is doing to the humans who live and thrive in the Arctic. So for Inuit, it would be a little bit like asking you, if you travel across a bridge or if you drive on a highway every day, how would you feel watching a loved one go out onto that bridge or highway knowing that they might never come back? I think that so much of the conversation is about certainty. And I think that both what Joel does and what I do and what so many people are trying to do around the world is just to ensure that the people that are most affected by this change have the strongest voice.
Thanks, Shelley. Over to you, Rihanna. What does climate change mean for you in the places where you live and work and in your home?
Well, I just wanted to say miigwech to Joel and Shelley first. I'll introduce myself too in my language. So Buju Manganis Gan Jean Jean Kutuk Indigenous Kazma Kwan Dutam Nyongashi and Dunji. So yeah, my English name is Rihanna Seymour and I'm a Anishinaabe and I come from the Bear Clan. So my perspective is a bit different. So I've lived in different places across Canada. in my young life, I guess, and the sense of urgency to climate change differs depending on where I am. And I think, yeah, I do want to make clear though that like all of us, we're all dealing with the impacts of colonialism throughout Canada and throughout the world. And climate change impacts fall within that category because impacts are exacerbated through the actions of colonial governments. And also just not listening to Indigenous decision makers and respecting Indigenous jurisdiction. So this comes to the foundation of Canada as well, this issue. So just to answer the question, I've seen within my lifetime back home how winters have less snow, or it snows more, the summers are more dry, or these patterns are expected to continue. And I see our lake being impacted and the pollution from overuse isn't helping. So also recognizing these cumulative effects that are also part of or supporting climate change impacts worsening. So, you know, and then I also hear in my own community how people are having to go deeper into the bush to harvest our birch bark, for example, because, you know, it's not strong enough closer to town. And I hear on the territories that I live, work, and play on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories, like how the flood management in response to the rising sea levels is often done without Indigenous people's collaboration, and it ends up impacting their communities, you know, directly. So, you know, there has been discussions happening that I've never been a part of in the last few years since living on these territories. And I didn't think I would ever be a part of these discussions either. So just the sense of urgency is felt stronger here than it is at home, although it is still very important back home. But the priorities are a bit different because we're still dealing with all of these other impacts or all of these other issues because of, you know, survival mode for a lot of Indigenous governments and communities. So, you know, now living here, I'm hearing about like sea level rise and tsunamis and earthquakes, things like that. So it's very, very different from back home, which is more central Canada. And I guess like what climate change means to me is it's just pretty sad and pretty frustrating because these things could have been avoided if Indigenous jurisdiction and decision-making was respected. But I guess like just balancing that with hope is really necessary too, because there's still a pathway forward. We can still solve this problem. And I think it begins with really listening and following Indigenous stewardship and ways of knowing, because they are most connected with their territories and they have lived experience and expertise that others do not have. So I think moving forward in that way would be really, really great.
Right. So we're going to move now to talking about the unique ways that our panelists and those that they work with are grappling with these issues. We just have a short video to start off this next section here.
The origin story of Akarvik is that it really emerged out of a gap where so much research is going on in the north, but young Inuit weren't meaningfully engaged in not just the research, but in the whole way that research is being developed.
Youth, especially in the north, are not just sitting around waiting to inherit the planet. They are active now. Akarvik is providing them an opportunity to get involved in issues that are important for their community and to take some of these kinds of leadership roles.
To be able to come into this program that shows you firsthand what the strengths of traditional knowledge are and the strengths of science, But not just those, the strengths of them both working together is something so important that not a lot of people think about.
The way that Iqaluit bridges Indigenous knowledge and science is really critical for two reasons. I mean, one is just straightforward, you get better science. The other part of it, though, that I'm really passionate about is that it's not asking young Indigenous Northerners to stop being themselves. In fact, it's rewarding them for having a strong connection to their cultures and their communities, while at the same time giving them new transferable skills to help them answer the questions they have about a changing Arctic. To watch them light up, to see them recognize their value and their role and the gifts that they bring to it is just every single day is a joy.
So Shelley, tell us more.
Well, that was great because now I don't have to tell you anything. You've met some of the young people that I work with. I end with that really ugly face because I'm like trying not to cry. Like every day is a joy. But honestly, I think this needs to be a part of our discussion is that with uncertainty, with these things that on paper are horribly destructive and awful and just devastating, have actually created this amazing opportunity for youth to step up. In my role with Iqaluit, I think it's really important to again acknowledge, like, I'm not Inuit, I'm full-on white girl. And honestly, the last thing the world needs is another well-intentioned white researcher coming up and telling the world about the Arctic. So my role and the role of Iqaluit is really to provide the thing that all of us need, which is time and space. In the North, we seriously lack infrastructure, we lack good internet, we have horrible internet, our education system is so on paper it should be this place that is just like helpless and not knowing how to proceed. But what I see is that a changing environment is also creating a changing environment and an opportunity for young Indigenous people. With Inuit, and we've now expanded over to the Yukon, where we are now partnering Inuit youth with First Nations youth in Canada. There's this amazing, joyful opportunity to combine the voices of the people who are experiencing the most change and actually amplify that. So our approach is really kind of simple. We give young people the time and space to answer a pretty basic question, which is, if research was completely up to you, what would you be studying? My vision is that research equals power, that if you can influence the knowledge that decision makers get, they can make better decisions. To this point, a lot of the research is, and the narrative has been controlled by outside people. So you get universities, you get government coming up, and people will parachute into the community and show up wearing brightly colored Gore-Tex and start to tell you about your own world. And the critical piece that's been missing is having the people that know the place the best, being able to inform and ultimately provide better knowledge for decision making. So youth are able to step into this gap because they have what my colleague Eric Solomon calls a superpower. They have the ability to have a foot in two worlds. And a lot of time youth feel very, very sad that they're being told that they have a foot in two worlds, but I'm like super jealous of that. If you can have Indigenous knowledge and also the ability to use science and technology, you have these two ways of knowing that can be combined. So our youth are able to take the things that Inuit have always known and combine it with science and technology to create really powerful tools for decision making.
Thanks, Shelley. And I just want to remind everyone that there's going to be an opportunity to answer some of your questions. Please use that chat to jot down the questions as we go along, and we'll be taking a break for that in just a little bit. So in order to highlight some of Joel's work, we're going to share another video.
Siku, the Inuktitut word for sea ice, connects communities across the Arctic. Siku, the Indigenous Knowledge Social Network. Siku is a mobile app and web platform created by and for Inuit, providing tools for weather, ice safety, and hunting stories, as well as knowledge transfer and language preservation.
The weather's changing, the ice conditions is changing. When we're driving a snowmobile or walking, we have to think before we get on that ice.
So this one's no good. If you try to pass by through this, you'll lose your snowmobile.
Siku puts Indigenous knowledge and observations front and center alongside weather and safety services, including sea ice products, tides, marine forecast, and satellite imagery. This lets hunters share dangerous and changing conditions with their communities using their own language and knowledge systems.
We used to get our information on 5 different websites.
Now with Siku, all that information is one place, also with the information from the elders and hunters.
Siku includes profiles for wildlife, sea ice, and traditional place names in multiple dialects that are taggable and act as living wikis of Indigenous knowledge. Using the mobile app while you're on the land, posts such as hunting stories and GPS tracks can be recorded and uploaded to Siku when you are back in your community.
Oral history has been a big part of the Inuit tradition. Nothing was written, so everybody just had a good memory.
Now with the Siku, we are providing new ways how the Inuit knowledge and science can work together.
Siku helps you document the data that has always formed the basis of Indigenous knowledge and mobilize it for use in community-based monitoring, guardian programs, and self-determination in research and environmental stewardship.
With Siku, we get to decide how we share our knowledge.
Siku is a safe place to share our hunting stories.
As the only social media platform putting Indigenous rights first, Siku includes privacy settings tailored specifically for Indigenous knowledge, ensuring that no one can use your data without permission.
You become a hunter because you keep practicing and you follow, and you let the elders take the lead.
You still need your harpoon to stay safe on the ice, and now with Siku, you can mobilize your knowledge, connecting hunters, elders, and youth for the benefit of future generations.
I think Inuit clothing, the feathers that we use, and traditional tools combined with technology and the tools of today's modern youth, and you put them together, would be amazing.
Integrating Indigenous ways of knowing with a suite of modern technologies. Siku, the Indigenous Knowledge Social Network, now available for Android, iPhone, and online at siku.org. Brought to you by the Arctic Eider Society.
So, Joel, what else would you like folks to know about your approach to grappling with these issues?
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate the time. We work closely with Akavik as well, and unfortunately, Candace isn't able to be here to help represent that connection. But Shelley's really emphasized, a lot about how we can help empower these youth and these voices. And I think our role has been through this as a tool. And so we've worked with most all of the Akavik communities to help co-develop Siku, as well as Inuit organizations and groups like Nunavut Siviniksivut, so that they can be a core part of creating that as well. And Candace has been a leader in training and doing that and presenting it. And so it's about engaging Inuit in all stages of the process. And so part of, our approach to, in addition to kind of like the on the ground work that we do with communities helping support self-determination, is to provide this as a tool to implement these sorts of visions and to implement things like the National Inuit Strategy on Research. People understand it a little bit. I think for a while, it took a long time for people to really understand the issues and why sometimes researchers were kind of in the way of Indigenous knowledge and that self-determination. And now it's a place where they understand, but they still aren't quite sure what to do about it, right? And so this is providing a tool. And in many ways, it's pretty simple. I mean, there's lots of complicated tools, and we're the Arctic Eider Society. Senekilowak used eider ducks for their clothing and food as their main source of technology. Traditionally, we do a lot more than ducks now. Our film People of a Feather kind of goes into that backstory. But eiderdown is the warmest feather in the world. It's the best of nature's technology, and it's the best of Inuit innovation in terms of how they use that for their technology, for their clothing and food. And just because technology is new, it doesn't mean it's better. And so our app, your mobile phone will freeze out on the ice unless you put it in your eiderdown parka, right? And we can now tag Inuktitut ice terminology and wiki social media profiles, but you still need your harpoon to make sure you're not going to fall through the ice, like Candace said in that video. So how can we bring together the best of modern technology and traditional Inuit knowledge and bring those together, science, indigenous knowledge? And so part of the innovation, in addition to like the technology side, is around indigenous environmental terminology. And so, reflecting on what were the disparities there, right? So one of our elders, Peter Akatuk in Sanakilowac, who helped inspire this, in People of a Feather, he talks about how he's seeing the diets of seals change from lots of fish to more shrimp. And, he was seeing big ecosystem changes by being out there every single day, seeing what was happening with the seals that he was harvesting and making a mental note. And, he would tell that to researchers. So this is an example, Inuit sharing their knowledge with researchers, and they'd be like, wow, that's cool. That could be really important, but it's anecdotal. We need data, right? And scientists would spend 5 years trying to prove what Inuit had already told them was true. And then they would be like, oh yeah, you were right after all that time and money, which is really frustrating, right? Because, we need quicker responses. And the real difference there, when you drill down on it, is that the difference was that scientists are really good at writing stuff down, almost too good and excruciatingly good. And indigenous knowledge has been based on oral history. So there's still a peer review system, talking with hunters and elders. They're still getting data every single day they're out there. And people write it off as qualitative or anecdotal, but it's not. Every single day, he saw what the seals were eating and their body condition and where they were. He just wasn't writing it down. And so the idea was, with the app, you take a picture, you can tag the prey just like you would tag a person on Facebook. You can tag Inuktitut terminology. And these words that we now have, these taggable profiles, are not just words, right? They're some of the indigenous language that's most at risk of getting lost to the next generation, but they're the key concepts in Inuit Kayumaitukanga. They are the key foundation. They're not just a word, they are the knowledge system. Ice classification, the terms for ice classification are the Inuit science about different kinds of ice that are more detailed than scientific classification systems. So by mobilizing this, allowing people to document that, to tag it in a familiar social media framework that Inuit have come up with a lot of their own innovations and uses for, it allows that data that's always been behind indigenous knowledge to be mobilized, and for Inuit and other indigenous groups to be empowered to be on a level playing field and to be involved in decision making and be like, look, here's the data that proves what we've always said all along. So that's the real innovation behind it.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much. We're going to move now to Rihanna Seymour Houry, who's going to tell us a little bit more about RELAW, or the Revitalizing Indigenous Law for Land, Air, and Water program.
Hey, thanks again to Shelley and Joel. So yeah, I grapple with these issues through lawmaking and supporting deliberation and dialogue. So I'm a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law. We're located in Vancouver of British Columbia. And like I said too, like I'm the manager of the program called RELAW, Revitalizing Indigenous Law for Land, Air, and Water. So in our program and our organization, we believe that Indigenous law is law. And Indigenous laws are expressions of worldviews, Indigenous knowledge, governance, and expressions of jurisdiction. Indigenous laws hold many, many sources, but we focus on the stories and deliberation and discussion with experts and knowledge holders. But other sources of law are, songs and like natural law, for example. So like the changes in the natural world on the water and things like that. There's also sacred law or sacred sources of law. So, that often comes from treaties, and treaties are solemn agreements between nations in Canada that outlined responsibilities to each other. So it was often guided by Indigenous law and process. So yeah, Indigenous law and expressions of worldview can come from many different sources, but within the RELAW program, we focus on stories and we focus on deliberation, so discussion with experts. So what I've noticed working with my own Anishinaabe law all my life, but also becoming familiar with other legal traditions such as Halkomelem legal traditions, is that it's often based on responsibility to rather than control over. So within the Western way of thinking and the Western way of making law, it's often controlling of. So controlling the way water flows, controlling how it or controlling the flood management, all these things. So very much controlling the use of water, but then from the Indigenous law perspective, it's often responsibility to protect, to ensure that water flows, to ensure that water can pursue its responsibilities to all other living beings and creatures. So very, very different way of looking at the world. So in RELAW, we have a few aspects in how we do this work. So the first aspect is the research part of it. So this is where we basically do our homework. We get familiar with stories, and then we begin to go into community and have dialogue guided by story. And then we offer our legal expertise in offering, facilitation in dialogue to ensure that they can make decisions. So that's the research aspect of it, and it's very much full of trust building, relationship making, and it was meant to last for a year, but sometimes it could last longer than that because relationship making often requires more time. So that's the reality of it. Then the next part, so in the research part, we create this legal synthesis. So it weaves all of the knowledge together that we've learned over the last year or two. And then we move into the next aspect. So now that we have all of this information, what's next? How does the nation want to apply this Indigenous law work? Do they want to make an expression of law? Do they want on the ground enforcement? So we support with that strategizing piece within the legal context, but also the communications context, because those two are very, very important to get the community and the nation on board, but also just to be, clear on what the purpose of this work is. And then the next aspect of it is the enforcement. So, how to enforce this work. And I said that earlier, but do they want to go create an expression of Indigenous law? Like, for example, we've worked with the Heiltsuk people in British Columbia, and they're creating, taking care of our Oceans and Relatives Act based on their own Heiltsuk laws. So that's just one example. But really, like, all of our work within the RELAW program is guided by principles of collaboration, partnership, trauma-informed practice. So we maintain training with ourselves, but also with the people and the representatives of nations we work with. We incorporate land-based learning and actually gathering together in person on the land to really formulate and strengthen those relationships. And that we understand that Indigenous peoples are the experts in their territories and who have witnessed these changes from both natural and human caused events over time. So, we really recognize that, and our work is about capacity building. So supporting people's unique gifts to support in the revitalizations of their laws. There's a lot of co-learning opportunity that happens within our program because we recognize that, we don't hold all the answers, but we have a lot to learn as well. But we also recognize that we have specific tools and ways of understanding within the Canadian legal context that we can offer to these strategies and, Indigenous law enforcement and recognition. So, yeah, just we support with increasing that decision-making level playing field, as Joel mentioned. And I think I'll stop there.
Great. I'm going to turn it over to Barb Steele from Ashoka Canada, who's going to bring forward some of the really interesting questions that have been coming forward in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Great conversation so far, and the videos were really wonderful to help us really feel and experience what it's like where you're working. So one of the first questions I'd like to ask is, where is it? You know, these ideas make so much sense. I'm wondering why these approaches aren't being used more broadly, or put another way, what will it take for us to listen and act on Indigenous and Inuit knowledge as a society? Shelley.
Well, I mean, I can speak from personal experience. It's all about shutting up and listening. So I think that, you know, there's some reframing that's needed. It's kind of awkward actually to see people in context where they could be learning from Indigenous people, and yet they're not taking that opportunity because, you know, from a Southern Canadian context, you're groomed to be knowledgeable and to be confident and to say how much you know, and yet no one teaches you humility and how to stop and listen. I've been in this community now, and honestly, the longer I'm here, the less I know. I think I would invite people to consider themselves a beneficiary of Indigenous knowledge, because if you take that opportunity to just stop, don't feel the need to have an opinion, don't feel the need to know the answer, but actually come in a humble way and learn and listen. I think that you know, our experience with the Karvik is that we don't do this work in isolation. As Rihanna mentioned, you know, there's capacity building, but then there's also capacity sharing. And eKarvik is very much focused on the idea that, you know, there is this struggle for Indigenous knowledge to be listened to and to be understood. But in order to do that, we need to work through a lot of the baggage and the history that exists with research. So what we've chosen to do with our youth is just skip right past all of that and go right to indigenizing research. So rather than get caught up in the trap of trying to convince people that this is a real thing, we just skip right past that. And we go right to the fact that it is a real thing, and that it is probably, as Joel mentioned, the most timely way to deal with a very time-sensitive issue of climate change. So, you know, Joel's example was excellent. If a researcher wanted to come to the Arctic to study something, you got to come up with your question, you got to develop your methodology, get that run through your committee, find your funding, get your tools, get everything up there. By the time you've done this, and you've hopefully got the right data, and you've returned out of the Arctic to study this out of its proper context, so much time has passed that this doesn't need to have happened. So we look at the opportunity for capacity sharing, and that really requires people to come in with the mindset that the people that live in a place know it the best. And youth are, again, perfectly positioned to not, I think, be weighted down by the history and the tradition of Indigenous people being squashed down and not listened to. So they have no problem putting their arm around a researcher and going, all right, dummy, we're going to tell you how this works. And I think that once we're able to get to that point where we're not bringing Indigenous knowledge into research or into decision making, but we're actually indigenizing the process, it means that we're all doing better as human beings to be able to use knowledge, the best knowledge available for decision making. So I guess that was a pretty long answer, but a pretty short reality, which is just shut up and listen, because when you do, you're going to get the best knowledge for decision making.
Awesome, Shelley. Thank you. So, I think that was very clear. Rihanna, did you want to take a few moments to respond to that question?
Yeah. So I reflect on this question a lot, and I think my answer changes throughout time. But right now, I would say to kind of reflect on the question as to why is it that Indigenous knowledge is excluded or isn't fully recognized as, or is recognized as anecdotal, for example, rather than fact, rather than truth. And I think this goes back into history too, and the foundation of, statehood or states, for example, Canada. So with Canada, what justifies crown sovereignty is the doctrine of discovery. And that's terra nullius. So the doctrine of discovery is inherently racist, and it holds the assumption that Indigenous peoples are inferior. And Canadian law is based on this assumption. So this assumption was able to kind of bleed into our consciousness and into our bodies and to our psyches and way of thinking. So I think like understanding the why is this assumption so prevalent across the world? It could really support an understanding, why it's hard to listen sometimes, because this is what we've been taught, So yeah, I'll just offer that as some reflection.
That's amazing, Rihanna. Thank you for that. I'm going to turn to some questions from our audience. Joel, this is a question for you from Jesse, who's asking, who funded the SIKU app development, and did community members receive remuneration for data collection and uploading?
Yep, awesome question. So over the years, right from our prototype early on, it was kind of funded by a number of different projects that it was being used for from various levels of government. But where it really took it off was we won the Google.org Impact Challenge in Canada, and that really helped us scale it up to a whole nother level. And so, everyone that was involved in the process of co-creating that was compensated along the way. And now it's really providing a way to provide jobs for Inuit. And so all the data that we've collected in the year since launch now on the Belcher Islands, we're working to create a Hecate protected area to protect the whole islands and develop conservation economies for the community. So jobs in environmental monitoring and research, natural history filmmaking, stay tuned for Frozen Planet 2, for tourism and hunting, all these sorts of things is what we're looking. It's all about jobs for Inuit, using that knowledge and skill. And so, we'll release a video soon. In the middle of a pandemic, no researchers were allowed to come to the north. And this is when it really paid off to have invested in Inuit communities, because they were there and ready to go. And so, we would have had to totally shut down. But, in a community of 800-900 people, 200 people are on the SIKU app, 100 of them are making posts. And so one approach, the traditional approach, would have been, let's hire a bunch of researchers to come up and do some baseline inventory on what the fish population looks like here. Men, women, elders, youth of these 100 people, every single time they went out hunting, fishing, they documented their tracks, they documented how many fish they caught. We can tell what ones are sea run versus landlocked. They crowdsourced a resource inventory that during the pandemic supported all these people, some of them on income support, to not just sit around, but to go out, to contribute to bringing back food during the pandemic to their communities, to have extra income, to everyone in the community working together to be part of the process of crowdsourcing that resource inventory. And we're almost up to the year mark now where it's birds, mammals. We crowdsourced the whole goose migration for the first time across 27 Inuit communities, right? Working together to look at the timing of migration, nesting. And, we're building a framework where other people, they don't have to be there, they can hire Inuit to do this. Some hunters are working on programs that involve equipment and scientific equipment and using it, where they're hired on a daily basis. Other people are documenting observations using their own knowledge systems as they're engaged in their own harvesting activities. And the idea is some of those people are on income support, and it just kind of helps build on their income support to build the training and the experience that will then get them off income support and into these jobs in environmental monitoring. So it's really exciting for us what this looks like in the long term. We're working to empower the knowledge of Inuit women on the platform too, where people can help market seal products like sealskin mitts, which is the only way your hands aren't going to freeze up in the north, and link it to the hunting story the same way hipsters like to know the name of their cow, and add value to these products and connect conservation economies, connect the economic systems that are real economic systems, all these intangibles, externalities that are in southern economic systems. This is a real deal up north, and Siku is going to make those connections in ways that have never been possible. And then you are going to be able to show the world what real economic systems look like as a result of this. So we're really excited. So thank you for asking that question. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, panelists, I have about 3 more questions and not a lot of time, so we're going to squeeze them in here. We've had a question, what are some action steps that an individual living in the city could take to live in closer partnership with nature? Why don't we just take, why don't we take 2 answers? You can just let me know if you are ready. Action steps someone living in the city can take.
I could offer some action steps, I think, can be very simple and on your computer. So, you know, like recognizing whose territories you're on, maybe even learning a word in their language. And then what I did for myself when I moved to these territories, I took it upon myself to learn the history of colonization. So like when peoples here were first being contacted, my peoples back home were already making treaty. So like the history is very, very different depending on the territory itself. So recognizing that there's Indigenous law and stories there that could also be available. So the nation's own stories, they often have publications available, or biographies or things like that are really helpful in providing that doorway into a different way of understanding. But also that actual Canadian history that happened is also helpful in understanding the context of today. So.
Thank you, Rihanna. Okay, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to think about what we can do to support you in your work. We've got a couple of hundred people on the line here, and others will hear this stream. So what is it that you need in order to succeed and scale your work? Shelley, I'll go to you first.
Oh man, then I can't steal Joel and Rihanna's answers. Okay, fine. Well, I guess I have as much of an invitation as I do an ask. You know, clearly when you live in a small remote community like I do, there's issues with bandwidth, there's issues with infrastructure. You know, I'm not asking people to help me solve that, but it would be nice to not have to run everything off my kitchen table. So if anyone wants to fly me in an office, I will happily accept that. I think though, really, in order to make the work that the youth here are doing really meaningful, it's an invitation to consider how to think about Indigenous knowledge and climate change. That when we talk about Indigenous knowledge with the youth, one of the things that they made abundantly clear that kind of blew people's minds was that often when we talk about Indigenous knowledge outside of an Indigenous environment, people are kind of fearful. They don't really know how to think about it. They feel like there's a lot of guilt associated with it because of the history and the baggage associated with colonialism. And the youth are just so well positioned to be able to say, let's think about this in a different way. That when we're talking about Indigenous knowledge and climate change, it's equally about the data. And absolutely, there's amazing data that can be used to understand climate change. But the way that the youth have educated me is that it's about the way we work together in the first place. That for Inuit, for example, it's called Inuit Kauyamaya Tukangin. So try to say that. Inuit Kauyamaya Tukangin. And what that basically is 8 societal values that determine how you can become a capable human being. And it's about working together for the common good. It's about social harmony. It's about doing the best job you can as a human being. And I think climate change has sort of given us a bit of a kick in the butt to be able to to have that opportunity, and COVID is really built on it, to stop and really reframe what it means to look at this uncertainty and change, and to figure out that a lot of times the answer is already there, and that it's more for us about how you work together. So that functional way of working together in order to understand the knowledge. So that would be what I would say.
Thank you, Shelley. Joel, how would you answer that question? How can participants support you? What do you need to scale your work?
Yeah, CECU right from the very design in the beginning has been built to scale, and so we're looking for support to kind of take it up to that next level. After 1 year of launch, it's been amazing to see what's been happening in Senakilawak and then broadly across communities with the Goose Watch, and regional organizations like the Nunatsiavut government are taking CECU to all the Inuit communities across the coastal Labrador right now. And so we want to build scale in terms of content. So we're looking to add SILA, being the Inuktitut word for weather, to add a bunch more terminology and profiles for Inuit to document climate change for weather and snow and permafrost and all these things. And this is going to help reduce the climate change, the carbon footprint of Arctic research by letting Inuit do that research instead of a lot of helicopters and icebreakers going around. So we want to scale up our capacity. Candice, who was going to be on the panel today, is a great example of someone that started with Akavik as a member helping create CECU and then was elevated to being a community coordinator or a regional coordinator and presenting CECU at the United Nations. And so we want her to help train other Inuit women to be the champions in their communities and regions to scale up the capacity that way. At home in Senakilawak, we're working to develop a facility for the protected area that's going to help support all the conservation economies that we talked about in Senakilawak and be a headquarters for CECU and Arctic ITER in the north. And in our short-term needs, because of COVID, construction prices are 3 times what they were, and there's a lot of logistical challenges. And so we are under budget what we need there. So we're looking for a sponsor to come on and help us make that building the first net zero building in the Arctic, so that our vision for environmental stewardship and sustainability can kind of work together with that facility to showcase, the renewable energy side and the sustainability of the north. So lots of opportunities to get involved if you like.
Thank you, Joel. Rihanna, I have less than half a minute left. Just wondering if you have something you'd like to say around how the support that you might need.
Sure. So like I said, climate change is scary, but Indigenous peoples have survived on these territories through famines, pandemics, droughts, and ice ages throughout these territories, and have brilliant offerings to offer. So as they are most familiar with their territories. And with the RELAW program and West Coast Environmental Law, we are a not-for-profit charity. So your donations can go towards supporting our work with nations, as we do provide capacity support for individuals who are willing to champion this work. And that those donations would also go to just supporting this work going forward. But also you can follow us, West Coast Environmental Law, on all social media platforms at WCELAW, so WCE Law, because we do amplify other voices and offer content all the time on these issues. So yeah, those are a few things you could do for our program.
Thank you, Rihanna. And Jessica, back to you.
And I just wanted to invite each of our panelists to share any final thoughts you have. Is there a message you might have for others around the world who are facing the impacts of climate change? We have just 5 minutes left. Any final remarks? What messages do you have? Jill?
Sure. For us, one of the most exciting and hopeful things is the collaboration that's come out of it. Communities in the Arctic are remotely isolated in the pandemic without travel. It's been even more isolated. And, CECU is helping with a lot of things, knowledge transfer within communities between elders and youth. But part of the really exciting thing is that knowledge transfer between communities and between Inuit and scientists and between Inuit and decision makers. And so, things like the Goose Watch migration that helped source that connection, that big picture stuff that came by all those communities. It's more than the sum of the parts of what those communities did. And that's the kind of action that's really exciting for us and gives us a lot of hope.
Thanks so much, Joel. Rihanna?
My hope definitely comes from the leadership and strength of Indigenous peoples asserting their own laws and ways of knowing. So they're going to continue to do this work with or without the support of allies. But, you know, I think it's a really prime opportunity to support this work where we can, because it is really needed. And it is really needed, even though the work will continue without it.
Shelley?
Thank you. I didn't realize we actually got to ask people for stuff, so I'll just say, contact me later if you want to know how to support a Karvik youth. I think in terms of hope, I mean, honestly, I look at 60% of our territory being under the age of 30, and for them to regain the sense that Inuit are the original Arctic scientists and have such value and such strength in being able to flip the paradigm and create science that's not only locally but globally relevant is really exciting.
I want to say an enormous thank you to all of our panelists at a time when the climate crisis and indeed the pandemic can feel overwhelming. Your words really remind us that humans around the world have faced challenges through time and remained resilient by remembering the teachings of their ancestors and continuing to actively live them today. And I'm reminded of Shelley's words, to paraphrase, you know, this is a time when centering Indigenous law and knowledge in decision-making may be the most timely way to deal with a time-sensitive issue. So thank you very much to all of you and to Barb. Just a reminder of the messages at the beginning of our time together. Many of us on this panel have benefited from being Ashoka Fellows. We're so proud to be part of that community, and please do whatever you can to continue to support Ashoka Fellows and Ashoka around the world. Thank you so much. And that